In the previous video on the book of Judges, we concluded our overview of the book proper. Now we'll turn our attention to literary observations, followed by historical and theological. First then, what sort of things are going on in this book of a literary sort? Several of these you'll recognize as having been touched on before, but let's collect them here so that we see the sort of variety that's included in this book. First is the use of inclusio, where an element begins and ends a segment, so that the repetition seems to draw the book to a conclusion, reminding us of how it began. In this case, it has to do with the question that's posed, who shall go up first? And this is a question, which tribe among the nation of Israel should go up first in battle? It appears first in chapter 1, and then in chapter 20. That's the next to the last chapter. Let's take a look at the actual biblical passages so that we see what's going on with these. The screen is set up now so that we have Judges 1 displayed on the left and Judges 20 displayed on the right. The left happens to be New Revised Standard Version. On the right, it happens to be the New American Standard. So in Judges 1, verse 1, we read, after the death of Joshua, the Israelites inquired of the Lord, and here's the question, who shall go up first for us? Now notice who it is they're going up against. They're going up against the Canaanites. So this is a question concerning receiving the land that God has promised them, asking God's direction for strategy to carry out what He's commanded them to do. When we come to Judges 20, and here we are on the right with Judges 20, beginning with verse 18, now the sons of Israel arose, went up to Bethel, and inquired of God, who shall go up first for us? Same exact question. And once again, they're asking God for direction. So far, so good. But now the twist comes, the tragedy of it. For it is not against the Canaanites, but against one of their own tribes that they are launching this punitive attack. And God says it is Judah that should go up first. Even this is the same as at the outset of the book, isn't it? Notice this. The Lord said, Judah shall go up. So on the one hand, we can see similarity, but with a reversal, and that in fact would be a second literary feature that makes this such a powerful use of inclusio. With a reversal, it is not overcoming external enemies in order to establish the nation in the land as God had directed, but rather it's this civil implosion where one part of the nation is attacking another part as a result of the Levites' concubines' murder there in Gibeah. A second literary feature worth being aware of in this book is the fact that chapter 5 of the book of Judges, known as the Song of Deborah, has preserved archaic Hebrew expression. We commented earlier that this is not uncommon. When something is in poetry, it tends to become frozen expression. People don't simply paraphrase and update it because that ruins some of the beauty of how it was crafted. So it tends to become stable, fixed in its expression, and so it persists even as the living language under it, spoken in daily usage by the people of that nation or group, while that living language will change, something of a literary piece like a poem will be frozen and will retain earlier features of the language. Chapter 5 of Judges then preserves some of the oldest Hebrew language of the Hebrew Bible. A third literary feature is Jotham's fable. And as you may recall in chapter 9, Jotham was one of the sons of Gideon, the sole surviving son after Abimelech, his half-brother, went on a rampage and slaughtered all of his other brothers. Jotham then proclaims this fable. It has to do with trees who supposedly are in conversation, who among the trees should rise up and be recognized as king over the other trees. Jotham uses a fable to speak to the people of Shechem, pointing out how foolish they have been to elevate Abimelech, this very vicious individual, to become king. We don't have many fables, that is, stories where non-human entities take up language and speak. In this case, it was trees speaking among themselves. We don't have many of these in the Hebrew Bible, so this is a rather unique, rather rare occurrence. The fourth element we want to draw attention to is the use of riddle. Samson's riddle in chapter 14 is what he used as a puzzle, somewhat to entertain and to challenge his guests, his friends, at his wedding. And it had to do with solving what it was that gave rise to something sweet, even though it came out from something powerful. And that was the lion's carcass, which had become the home of a beehive, so there was honey within it. Some have suggested that this may have been a custom associated with wedding celebrations. Some have suggested that perhaps this was the usual practice, that part of what a groom would do at his wedding was to propound a riddle as part of the overall festivities. I'm not sure this has been widely attested, but this gives you an idea of how people have studied this particular incidence of a riddle. Other places we can find riddles are in the book of Proverbs, particularly toward the end of it. A fifth element of a literary sort that's worth observing has to do with the stylized expression with regard to widespread killing that we find in places such as the account of Abimelech slaughtering his brothers. As you may recall, we have the statement that he slaughtered all 70 of his brothers, and yet we find out that Jotham, one of his brothers, has survived. Similarly, regarding the Benjamites, when certain girls from within Israel are arranged for kidnapping, basically to become the wives of the surviving Benjamites, we are told that all of the families of those girls were wiped out so that they would become available, in a sense. Again, part of the twisted thinking within this book. But we're interested right now in the expression of widespread killing. We're told that all their family members were wiped out, so these girls were alone. Nevertheless, we are told that circumstances were such that no one would complain about them being given to the Benjamites, which was in violation of a particular promise that the other tribes had made to each other. This raises the question, well, who among their families was alive to complain? So that's really a moot question. It makes us wonder whether or not all of their families actually had been wiped out. Sixth among the literary observations is the basic feature of repetition, here used with just incredible moral impact. And it has to do with the statement that there was no king over Israel at this time. This was pre-monarchical, the era of the judges. And people did what was right in their own eyes, this self-referential morality. Of particular importance is that one of the two uses of this expression appears as the very final verse of the entire book, chapter 21-25. It seems inescapable that the writer is wanting to deliver this point to us as his final moral observation regarding the health, or frankly, the illness of the nation at that point. The last item then, number 7, is known as the Judges cycle. Let's take a look at an earlier slide to remind ourselves what this consists of. Here then is that earlier slide showing the summary of this Judges cycle, which was given in chapter 2, 11 and following. And the principal recurring elements, that's why we call it a cycle, recurring elements in Israel's experience as recorded by the author of this book, involve Israel abandoning God, and then God opening the door and allowing neighboring tribes or nations to plunder Israel. This results in a captivity, and then Israel cries out for help. At that point, God has mercy on them, raises up a judge, and this once again is not a hereditary role, but an isolated leader whom he endows with the abilities to bring rescue, and typically this is a military rescue, throws off the oppression of those that had captured them, imprisoned, or rather subjugated them. That judge continues for years as a recognized leader. Sometimes there actually is judicial authority. We know of Deborah, for example, that she actually decided cases for them, so there was that component with their role. Unfortunately, at the faithfulness of Israel then typically only lasts as long as the lifespan of that judge. After that individual dies and that influence is removed, then Israel becomes wayward again, abandons God, and then things start over once again. As God lets them be plundered, they cry out to God. God raises up a judge. They walk with God during the lifetime of that judge, and so the cycle repeats itself. This is what we mean by the judge's cycle. Let's direct our attention now to just a couple of historical observations. In the first of these, archaeologists studying this particular era, the era corresponding to the judges, and the material evidence that remains, that is, tangible items which have been recovered from Canaan, from Palestine for this era, tell us how society was structured. The evidence indicates that this was not a tightly organized nation, but instead loosely related villages, and that corresponds to the sort of connectedness, or more importantly, disconnectedness from one particular city or village to another. That is the picture we get from the literary description of the book of Judges. The second historical note has to do with technology. We can tell that iron was developed around 1400 BCE. In the land of the Hittites is where this arose, and as a result, this gave military advantage to nations possessing this technology. Very interesting then when we come to Judges, there's a case of the haves and the have-nots, and the commodity which is either possessed or not possessed is iron. The haves are the people in the land. For example, Sisera's wheels of the chariots in his army are rimmed with iron. Just think for a moment about an iron bouncing over rocky terrain. How long is that wooden wheel going to last? Just imagine it being shattered by the impact, the rough impact. But if instead you can reinforce that with a ring of iron around it, how much longer that chariot is going to survive and be able to be a menace to the enemy in battle. Sisera's chariots have the iron-rimmed wheels, but Israel does not. And this is one of the features that's brought to our attention in chapter 4 as a reason that the Israelites feel intimidated by the people in the land who have this superior technology. As we turn our attention now to theological observations, let's begin by asking the question, how is God portrayed in this particular book? As you may recall, when we ask this question, we're not building a 100% theology from this book. We're rather inquiring of the book, what is it that you uniquely disclose about the character of God? As we do so, we go about building what's known as a biblical theology, a theology that is put forth by the various passages of Scripture, rather than building a systematic theology coming with a preformed grid of questions for which we search answers across the scope of Scripture. So from a biblical theology point of view, the book of Judges says some of these things about the nature of God. We find that when Israel behaves in a fickle fashion, when she behaves unfaithfully against God, dashing the covenant, showing that she is not willing to be completely committed in her relationship to God as her only divine sovereign, this affects God. He is anguished over this. God responds with punishment in order to convince Israel to change its course of travel. Israel behaves with apostasy, departing from God, and God repeatedly brings punishment to discipline the nation. But that's not all we see about God. We see that when Israel time and again cries out for mercy, God is responsive to this. He does not turn a deaf ear, a hardened heart. We also see that God is very able to rescue. This means that whenever Israel is plunged into a captivity or some sort of subjugation, it's not a case that God has somehow been overwhelmed. This would have been the thought of theologies of the surrounding nations. Their thought is that if they get defeated, that means the opponent's gods are stronger and their gods are too frail or weak. That sort of theology just does not fly in Scripture. God is always able to rescue. If anyone has been subjugated, it's because God has allowed it to happen, not because he has somehow been overpowered. And then I encourage you to consider thoughtfully the last bullet, because here we find that God, on a repeated fashion, time and again, comes to a point, evidently, of trusting the people. Isn't this what it means when he rescues them, sets up a judge, and lets the nation continue and make its choices? He's trusting them in their relationship to him, hoping, against hope, we might say, that they will prove faithful. And whenever a person exhibits trust in a relationship, that person then opens themselves up to risk of being betrayed again. And sadly, that is the experience of God with Israel, time and time again. And now, continuing with theological observations, let's ask the question, what does the book of Judges tell us about humankind? The book of Judges paints a vivid, very vivid picture of what does a society look like when the morality that they hold to, the moral compass that they cling to, is exclusively one of self-reference. And what I mean by that is that when humans become the determinants of what is morality, that is, we ourselves are our own measure of morality, then things spiral downward, things disintegrate and fall apart and implode, just like in the society pictured by the book of Judges. The contrast to self-referential morality would be a God-referential morality, one which seeks his direction, embraces his law and his rule, not just on a periodic consultation basis, but routinely, making sure that he is the one that the nation and the individuals in it seek to honor and serve. Isn't it just exceptionally revealing that when a nation embraces self-referential morality, they don't just throw out every vestige of spirituality, they will hold on to little threads and shreds here and there so as to have a veneer of spirituality when underneath there is just corruption and decay. So, for example, one instance of this we might recall comes in chapters 17 and 18. It surrounds the story of Micah, and you recall that he steals silver and then uses that after he restores it to his mother that he stole it from. She uses that to make an idol. And their confessed objective is to worship the Lord. Now, they are not worshiping Ashtoreth. They are not worshiping Baal or Dagon or some other deity. Yes, they're interested in worshiping God, the God of Israel, but they do it through idolatry. Now, how does that comport with God's commands? No other idol, no other God before you. This just does not fit. So you see, there is a veneer of spirituality, but they have so twisted it and made it an amalgam with other elements that it's no longer pure. Somewhat related to this, veneers of spirituality has to do with vestiges of morality which are just terribly tainted and poisoned. So, for example, in chapters 19 to 21, there at the close, they see that Benjamin has gone seriously wayward. And the behavior of the Gibeonites is just so reprehensible. They launch this, basically an extermination campaign against a tribe within their own company. And then they wake up to what they've done and say, well, this really wasn't such a good idea, with tragic consequences. And part of the spin-off of that was killing off one group within their alliance so that they could so-called liberate or make eligible these brides, which otherwise would not have been available, and they arranged for them to be kidnapped by the surviving Benjamite warriors. And on the one hand, you see there are some good motives, but the way they're carried out is in such a confused way. It's just exceptionally tangled. And it seems that the writer is wanting us to realize that this is what happens when people do what's right in their own eyes. By the way, that's the textual foundation for the tagline, self-referential morality. People were doing what was right in their own eyes. There was no king in Israel at that time. The last point under theological observations that we must take care to observe is this axiom that is delivered to us twice in the book, the second of which occurs in the last verse of the entire book. As we've noticed before, the writer declares, and this is my own translation of it, there was no king in Israel. Whatever seemed right in his own eyes, that is how each one behaved. Let's consider the parts of this. There was no king in Israel. On the surface, we would look at this statement, and aware as we are of later history in Israel, aware as we are that fairly soon there will be the development of the monarchy initiated under the prophet Samuel. So we would read this phrase, there was no king in Israel, and we would say, oh, this was simply during the era prior to the monarchy, prior to God identifying and setting up human kings. I wonder if you remember how it is that God described the onset of the human monarchy. When Samuel is lamenting the fact that Israel is insisting on having their own human monarch, God says to him, Samuel, it is not you that they have rejected, but it is me they have rejected. They have rejected me from being there, and notice this word, king. Perhaps it would be worth seeing this verse more clearly. It occurs in 1 Samuel 8, verse 5. Samuel's been responding to the people's request to give them a king. This is before King Saul. This will lead up to the selection and authorization of King Saul. Samuel prays to the Lord. The Lord said to Samuel, listen to the voice of the people in all they say to you, for they have not rejected you. And then notice this, but they have rejected me from being king over them. I encourage you to read those words over against what we see in Judges. Thus, in the light of the 1 Samuel passage, it seems that we should be hearing in this expression, there was no king in Israel, not simply the notion that the human monarchy had not yet been established within the nation of Israel, but on a spiritual level, the divine monarch, which God was to be for them during the period of the Judges, they rejected their divine monarch. There was no king, neither human nor divine, in Israel. And the way the absence of a divine monarch is recognizable is when one individual after another, and this is significant, isn't it? Notice the individualism. Each person, and certainly it characterized the nation as a whole, but it came right down to the behavior of the individuals. Each person does what's right in his own eyes. They are not looking to God for moral compass, but they are saying, oh, this is true for me. It may not be true for you, but it's true for me. So that is how I will live. What's right for me may not be right for you. Does that sound at all familiar? Judges has so much to say to the 21st century Western culture. We'll close our study of Judges by offering these thoughts in the way of application. And let's follow the practice of first imagining ourselves back in the audience that was receiving this book, hearing these stories. How would God have wanted that to impact us in that original setting? For the original audience, wouldn't we agree that Israel received these messages as a shocking reminder of how costly it is when a society pushes God out to the margin? Treat God that way, and this is what happens to you. It's a shocking, shocking story, one of the most violent and vivid accounts in all of Scripture. Also, the people of that time hearing these stories would have been reminded that despite the fact that in times past they had enjoyed the unique privilege of being chosen by God to accomplish a special purpose, despite the fact that in times past they'd enjoyed exceptional intimacy with God, that past history provides no guarantee of God's future approval of anything they may choose to do, or future intimacy, irregardless of how they choose to behave in the relationship, because it's of paramount importance that the relationship must be maintained. One must not presume on past pedigree for current and future intimacy with God. Already, I'm sure you are realizing how applicable these principles are for the church today, for our individual discipleship as followers of the Messiah, and for our society. For the book of Judges, like no other book in the Bible, shouts out the fact that any society that begins to release its grasp of God, that begins to behave as though the standards and instructions and loving wisdom of God have now become negotiable, optional. Any society which determines that morality may just as well be self-referential. If it's good in my eyes, that's good enough for me. Whatever's good in your eyes, that'll be good enough for you. Any society which devolves to that level gradually will spiral out of control, and consequently that society will careen toward national self-cannibalization. As we watch the headlines on the news, increasingly we find violence of human against human, one neighbor against another. Sometimes we'll just chalk it up to say, well, there seems to be more craziness, violent and vicious craziness in the land. Is that a satisfactory answer? May it not be that persons who are behaving with widespread and massive violence, walking into places, institutions and schools which ought to be places of safety, and just spreading out death, may this not be one of the indicators that our society is living in the era of Judges? We have let go of the standards of morality that God has said, this is what will make for a safe and stable society. We have rejected God's direction for us. I'm not suggesting that we have been a Christian nation for any time in recent past, but not only that, we have said, we have even taken the guidelines, irregardless of subscribing to God's presence in our national lives, but we've taken his guidelines and directions and said those are optional too. What we're left with is what we see in the headlines, which is more and more a national self-cannibalization, much like we find in the latter chapters of Judges, one part of the nation launching war against another, and consequently there's just decimation, self-inflicted within our society. This is what happens when there is no king, no external reference, and in particular, when the directions and guidance of God are thrown out, cast out of court, cast out of out of society, cast out of communities. The message of Judges is a powerful one for our nation and society today.